Nobody noticed when Eleanor Whitmore stopped speaking at family dinners. They only noticed when the house stopped listening to them. The Whitmore dining room had been designed to impress people who already had too much money to be impressed. 40 feet of polished oak stretched beneath a crystal chandelier older than most American cities, reflecting warm gold light across silver, serving trays, and untouched wine glasses. Portraits of dead Whitmores watched from the walls with the same cold expressions every generation seemed to inherit. Outside the tall windows, rain slid slowly down the glass, softening the lights from the long driveway beyond the iron gates. Eleanor Whitmore sat halfway down the table in a pale blue cardigan, her silver curls carefully pinned the same way they had been for years. She folded her napkin once. Then again, nobody looked at her. Isabel sat near the head of the table beside David, pouring wine with effortless elegance while speaking about the upcoming charity gala as if she were already the owner of the entire estate. Her long blonde hair rested perfectly against the collar of her cream silk blouse. Every movement looked practiced, controlled. "The investors want a more modern direction," Isabel said smoothly. "The old image isn't working anymore." David loosened his dark tie without answering. At 42, he already looked exhausted in a permanent way, like sleep no longer reached him. He stared at the numbers glowing faintly on his phone beside the dinner plate. Ethan leaned against the staircase near the entrance to the dining room, pretending to scroll through messages while quietly watching everyone else instead. Harrison sat alone at the far end of the table wearing a faded denim jacket that looked completely out of place inside the mansion. His gray hair was uneven and slightly wild, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug instead of wine. Most people ignored Harrison the same way they ignored old wallpaper or distant thunder. Eleanor finally spoke softly. "Your father hated changing the West Garden this close to winter." Isabel continued pouring wine as if the comment had never been made. Victoria adjusted her diamond bracelet. David kept staring at his phone. Even the servants moved silently around the sentence like it no longer belonged in the room. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward her plate. A small piece of bread rested untouched beside polished silverware engraved with the Whitmore crest. James, the family's longtime butler, appeared beside her shoulder to refill her water glass. For a second, his expression shifted. Concern. Then it disappeared again beneath professional calm. Ethan noticed it. So did Harrison. The rain outside grew heavier. Isabel smiled faintly and raised her glass toward David. "By next month," she said quietly, "everything in this house will finally be where it belongs." Across the table, Harrison slowly lifted his eyes for the first time that evening. Eleanor said nothing more, but beneath the table, her fingers closed tightly around a yellowed envelope hidden inside her cardigan pocket. The Whitmore estate became strangely quiet after midnight. Not peaceful quiet, the kind that made every clock sound louder than it should. Eleanor woke before sunrise the next morning, just as she had for nearly 40 years. The hallway outside her bedroom remained dark except for the pale gray light filtering through the tall east windows overlooking the gardens. Somewhere downstairs, pipes groaned softly behind the walls. The house always sounded older in winter. She wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders and walked slowly toward the kitchen, her slippers barely making noise against the polished hardwood floors. Family photographs lined the corridor. Vacations in Martha's Vineyard. Christmas dinners beneath the same chandelier downstairs. David as a boy standing proudly beside his father near the stables. In almost every picture, Eleanor noticed the same thing now. She was always standing slightly behind everyone else. James was already in the kitchen preparing coffee when she entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently. Eleanor nodded and reached automatically for the ceramic mug her late husband always used. The cabinet shelf above it was empty now except for dust rings where expensive crystal had recently disappeared. Isabel had sold several pieces from the formal collection 2 months earlier. Nobody asked Eleanor first. "Did they eat breakfast yet?" she asked quietly. James hesitated. "Mr. David left early for the city. Mrs. Isabel is meeting the architects at 10. Eleanor stirred cream into her coffee slowly. "Architects?" "The West Wing renovation, ma'am." Eleanor looked up for the first time. "What renovation?" James lowered his eyes immediately. "I assumed they had already spoken with you." They had not. By late morning, the estate no longer felt like her home at all. Men in dark coats walked through the west hallway carrying folders and measuring equipment while Isabel guided them from room to room with calm authority. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase unnoticed while they discussed removing original fireplaces and expanding the lower ballroom into a modern entertainment space. "Nobody uses these old rooms anymore," Isabel said with a polite smile. "The house needs to feel current." Ethan arrived just before lunch, carrying a backpack over one shoulder. He stopped halfway through the foyer when he saw workers placing blue tape across the library doors. "What is all this?" he asked. Isabel barely glanced at him. "Progress." Ethan frowned. "Did Grandma agree to this?" Isabel adjusted a gold bracelet around her wrist. "Your grandmother does not concern herself with business decisions anymore." Upstairs, Eleanor quietly closed the door to her bedroom before anyone could see the expression on her face. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. She sat carefully on the edge of the bed and removed the yellowed envelope from her cardigan pocket again. Her late husband's handwriting stared back at her across the front. "Eleanor, only open this if they stop listening." That evening the rain finally stopped, but the clouds remained low above the Whitmore estate, turning the windows into dark mirrors against the dining room walls. Eleanor arrived downstairs early out of habit. She still believed dinner should begin on time, even if nobody else cared anymore. The long oak table had already been set with silver candle holders and folded linen napkins. Fresh, white roses sat at the center beneath the chandelier, arranged exactly the way Isabel preferred. Eleanor paused beside the fireplace when she noticed two movers carrying framed paintings through the hallway toward the rear entrance. One of them was a portrait of her late husband standing beside the original founder of Whitmore Holdings. The empty space left behind on the wall looked strange. Unfinished. "Where are they taking that?" she asked quietly. One of the men glanced uncertainly toward Isabel before answering. "Storage, ma'am." Isabel entered the room moments later wearing a dark green dress that matched the marble tones of the house. The art appraiser recommended rotating several outdated pieces, she explained smoothly. "The dining room needs a cleaner aesthetic." Eleanor stared at the empty wall a second longer. "Richard chose that portrait himself." Isabel smiled politely without warmth. "And times change." David arrived late, carrying a leather folder under one arm. His face looked pale beneath the soft chandelier light. He loosened his collar before sitting down and immediately reached for a glass of bourbon instead of wine. Victoria followed close behind him, sharp-eyed and perfectly composed in a black tailored suit despite the late hour. "We cannot delay this much longer," she said under her breath as she sat beside Isabel. Ethan heard it from the staircase again. He always seemed to appear silently whenever the adults thought nobody younger was paying attention. Harrison remained at the far end of the table wearing the same worn denim jacket from the night before. He had not touched the expensive meal James placed in front of him. Instead, he watched David carefully, almost the way a mechanic listens to an engine before it fails. Halfway through dinner, headlights appeared outside the front windows. A black sedan rolled slowly up the circular driveway. James entered quietly from the foyer. "Mr. Thomas Hale has arrived." Isabel froze for less than a second before recovering her expression. "At this hour?" Victoria asked sharply. Nobody answered immediately. Thomas Hale stepped into the dining room, carrying a weathered leather briefcase against his chest. At 73, the Whitmore family attorney moved slowly but with deliberate precision, his silver glasses reflecting the chandelier light as he surveyed the room. His eyes stopped briefly on Eleanor before shifting toward David and Isabel. "I apologize for the interruption," Thomas said calmly. "But there are several documents regarding the estate that require immediate clarification." David sat upright instantly. Isabel lowered her wine glass without making a sound. Across the table, Harrison finally leaned back in his chair and smiled very slightly for the first time in years. Thomas Hale placed the leather briefcase carefully beside his chair before removing his gloves one finger at a time. The room had gone unusually still. Even the soft clinking of silverware had stopped. Rainwater glistened faintly on the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat as James quietly closed the dining room doors behind him. Isabel recovered first. "Surely this can wait until morning," she said with a controlled smile. "David has an early meeting in Manhattan." Thomas adjusted his glasses slowly. "Unfortunately, several recent filings concerning the Whitmore estate cannot wait." David stared down at the bourbon in his glass. Victoria folded her hands neatly atop the tablecloth. "What filings?" she asked. Thomas opened the briefcase and removed a stack of documents secured with blue tabs. Construction authorizations, property transfer requests, renovation approvals. Isabel spoke before anyone else could answer. "Those are routine updates." Thomas looked directly at her. "Not when signatures appear from individuals who never approved them." The chandelier hummed softly overhead. Ethan straightened near the staircase without realizing it. Across the table, Harrison remained completely expressionless, though one rough hand tightened slightly around his coffee mug. Eleanor sat quietly beside the fireplace, watching Thomas organize papers across the polished oak table. Her late husband used to trust Thomas more than anyone outside the family. She remembered countless evenings listening to the two men speak privately inside the study while cigar smoke drifted beneath the library lamps. Richard Whitmore had once said that good lawyers protected families from strangers. Great lawyers protected families from themselves. Thomas finally turned toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, I was under the impression these renovations had your direct approval." Isabel answered immediately. "Eleanor asked us to manage household matters after Richard passed." Eleanor looked at Isabel calmly. "I do not remember saying that." Silence settled over the room like dust. David rubbed both hands across his face before speaking. "Mother, nobody is trying to upset you. We are only trying to modernize things before the foundation board review. By removing my husband from the walls." Eleanor asked softly. David looked away again. Isabel leaned forward slightly. "This house needs stability. Investors are already nervous." "About what?" Ethan asked suddenly. Nobody responded right away. That alone told him enough. Thomas slowly slid one document across the table toward Eleanor. "There is another issue," he said carefully. Several requests were submitted regarding ownership restructuring of the estate itself. Victoria's eyes narrowed immediately. Isabel remained perfectly still. Only her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the document without touching it. At the bottom corner sat a signature dated 3 weeks earlier. Eleanor Whitmore. The handwriting looked almost identical to her own. Almost. Across the table, Harrison quietly muttered his first words all evening. "That is not her signature." The room froze. Even David finally looked up. David stared at the signature for several long seconds before reaching for the paper with visibly trembling fingers. The bourbon beside his plate remained untouched now. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said quietly. Isabel turned toward him with measured calm. "David, your mother signs dozens of household approvals every year. She probably forgot." "I did not sign it," Eleanor replied softly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Thomas adjusted another document beneath the chandelier light. There were 6 filings. Altogether, he explained. 2 construction approvals, 1 ownership amendment request, and 3 preliminary transfers connected to the Whitmore Foundation. Ethan stepped farther into the dining room. "Transfers to who?" Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed a second folder from the briefcase and slid it slowly across the table toward David. Isabel's expression changed for the first time that evening. Not panic. Something colder. Calculation. David opened the folder and immediately went pale. "These accounts," he whispered. Victoria leaned closer. "What is it?" David swallowed hard before answering. "They are connected to the Cayman Holding Group." Ethan frowned. "The offshore accounts." Nobody corrected him. Harrison finally leaned back in his chair, denim creasing softly against old leather. "Well," he muttered, "there it is." James entered silently carrying fresh coffee, but even he paused when he saw the look on David's face. The old butler had worked in the Whitmore house for 36 years. He had witnessed scandals, funerals, bankruptcies, political fundraisers, and quiet affairs hidden beneath expensive smiles. But this felt different. This felt like the foundation itself had started cracking beneath the marble floors. Isabel folded her napkin carefully beside her untouched dinner plate. Those accounts were created to protect the family during restructuring. Thomas looked directly at her. "You are not authorized to create restructuring plans involving estate assets. Richard intended for David to take control eventually." Isabel replied smoothly. "Richard intended many things," Thomas answered. "Most of them are documented very clearly." Eleanor remained silent while the conversation moved around her again. But something inside the room had shifted now. People were finally watching her face before they spoke. Ethan noticed it immediately. So did Harrison. David looked toward his mother slowly, as though seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "Mother, did father ever mention any of this to you?" Eleanor rested both hands lightly against the edge of the oak table. "Your father believed money changes people when they become afraid." Victoria exhaled sharply. "This family does not have time for riddles tonight." "No," Harrison said quietly from the far end of the table. But it had plenty of time to ignore her. Silence followed him like smoke. Then James stepped beside Eleanor and gently placed something near her plate. An old brass key attached to a faded leather tag marked East Wing Archive. Eleanor stared at it without touching it. Across the room, Isabel noticed the key and suddenly lost color in her face for the very first time. The house felt different after midnight. Not louder, quieter. The kind of silence that settles over a place after people realize something important has shifted and nobody knows exactly how far. Eleanor stood alone outside the East Wing corridor holding the brass key tightly in one hand while rainwater tapped softly against the tall hallway windows. Most of the mansion had been renovated over the years, but this section remained untouched. Richard Whitmore had kept it locked for nearly 2 decades. Isabel once called it dead space during a fundraiser tour. Eleanor remembered that clearly now. Harrison appeared behind her without making a sound. "He told me you would come here eventually," he said quietly. Eleanor glanced toward him. "You knew about this room?" Harrison shrugged beneath the old denim jacket. "I knew your husband trusted it more than he trusted people." Downstairs, voices still drifted faintly from the dining room. David and Victoria arguing in low tones. Isabel speaking too calmly. Thomas refusing to leave. The family had spent years believing Harrison was nothing more than an aging outsider Richard occasionally tolerated out of loyalty. Nobody ever asked why Richard trusted him enough to let him live on the estate grounds permanently. Harrison stepped beside Eleanor and looked toward the old brass lock. "Your husband believed families only show themselves clearly when money becomes uncertain," he said. Looks like he was right. The key turned heavily inside the lock. Dust floated through the air as the door slowly opened inward. The room beyond smelled like cedarwood, paper, and forgotten winters. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling filled with leather binders, storage boxes, and framed photographs hidden beneath white cloth covers. A long mahogany desk sat beneath the windows overlooking the rear gardens, untouched except for a single green banker lamp glowing dimly in the darkness. Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. Richard's fountain pen still rested exactly where he left it years earlier. Ethan appeared quietly at the doorway behind them, carrying a flashlight from the garage. "I figured you might need this," he said softly. Eleanor looked at her grandson carefully. He no longer seemed like a boy wandering through family arguments out of curiosity. Tonight he looked alert, older somehow. Harrison walked slowly toward a row of locked filing cabinets near the back wall. "Third drawer," he muttered. "That is where he kept the real records." Ethan opened the cabinet carefully while Eleanor approached the desk. Beneath the lamp sat another envelope in Richard's handwriting. Larger this time. Heavier. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside rested property deeds, trust documents, handwritten notes, and one final letter folded separately on cream stationery. Eleanor unfolded it slowly beneath the green light. "If you are reading this," Richard had written, "then they finally stopped seeing you as family and started seeing you as an obstacle." Ethan looked up from the filing cabinet at the exact same moment. "Grandma," he whispered carefully, "you need to see this." He held up a stack of transfer agreements already signed weeks earlier. Every single one carried Isabel's authorization. By morning, the Whitmore estate looked polished again, almost peaceful beneath pale winter sunlight. Staff moved quietly through the hallways preparing for the annual foundation dinner scheduled that evening. Fresh flowers replaced the white roses from the night before. Crystal glasses gleamed beneath chandeliers. Outside, black sedans rolled slowly through the front gates carrying board members, attorneys, and political donors from Manhattan. From a distance, the house still looked untouchable. Eleanor stood inside the East Wing archive wearing a soft gray sweater while sunlight filtered across the old desk where Richard once reviewed contracts late into the night. Ethan sat nearby surrounded by stacks of documents spread across the floor. He had barely slept. There are more accounts than Thomas mentioned, he said quietly while flipping another page. And these transfers were supposed to finalize next week. Eleanor looked down at Richard's letter again. Some sections had been underlined by hand years earlier. Never surrender control to people who mistake silence for weakness. Harrison entered carrying 2 cups of black coffee. Thomas is downstairs, he said, and Isabel is already performing for the guests. Ethan glanced toward the hallway. Does she know we found this room? Harrison took a slow sip from the coffee. If she does, she is smart enough not to show it yet. Downstairs, the mansion had transformed into exactly the kind of old-money spectacle Isabel understood perfectly. Candlelight reflected against polished marble floors while waiters in white jackets carried silver trays through the ballroom. Victoria greeted investors beside the grand staircase with controlled elegance. David looked exhausted in a tailored black suit, smiling only when someone important approached him directly. Isabel moved through the crowd effortlessly, touching shoulders lightly, laughing softly, guiding conversations exactly where she wanted them to go. She already looked like the future owner of the Whitmore legacy. Near the fireplace, Thomas reviewed several documents with Sophia Bennett, a young attorney from his firm recently assigned to estate oversight. Sophia listened carefully while occasionally glancing toward Isabel across the ballroom. You think she forged the signatures herself? Sophia asked quietly. Thomas adjusted his glasses. I think she believed nobody would ever question them. Upstairs, Eleanor slowly opened another storage box inside the archive room. Beneath old photographs and tax records rested a leather ledger marked Private Trust Holdings. Ethan leaned closer immediately. Inside were handwritten notes from Richard documenting every contingency tied to the estate. Voting rights, asset freezes, emergency, succession clauses. Harrison smiled faintly the moment Eleanor reached the final section. Read the last page, he said. Eleanor turned carefully toward the back cover. Her breath caught almost instantly. The final clause transferred complete temporary control of Whitmore Holdings to one person if financial manipulation or fraudulent restructuring threatened the family trust. Not David, not the board, not Isabel. Eleanor Whitmore. Downstairs, a champagne glass shattered somewhere near the ballroom entrance. Nobody upstairs moved. Harrison only looked toward Eleanor calmly and said the words Richard himself had once told him years ago. The house finally remembers who it belongs to. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as more guests filled the Whitmore estate, their voices blending into the soft sound of piano music drifting from the far corner near the marble staircase. Expensive coats disappeared into the hands of staff, while champagne moved endlessly through the room on silver trays. Investors laughed too loudly. Board members whispered near the fireplace. Nobody noticed the tension running quietly beneath the evening like a crack beneath frozen water. Isabel stood near the center of the ballroom, speaking confidently with 2 foundation trustees about the estate modernization plan. Every detail of the evening reflected her influence now. New floral arrangements, new branding displays, new architectural renderings framed beside the staircase. Even the old Whitmore family crest had been subtly redesigned for the presentation screens glowing near the library entrance. David remained close beside her, though his expression looked distant. He had spent most of the evening checking his phone and avoiding eye contact with Thomas. Victoria noticed it too. Pull yourself together, she whispered sharply while adjusting his tie. Weakness is expensive in this family. Across the ballroom, Eleanor finally entered quietly through the east corridor wearing a dark navy dress she had not worn since Richard's final foundation dinner 3 years earlier. The room changed before anyone consciously realized it had. Conversation slowed. Several older guests straightened. Immediately when they saw her, James moved silently beside her carrying a leather portfolio from the archive room. Ethan followed close behind, while Sophia spoke quietly with Thomas near the staircase. Isabel noticed Eleanor almost instantly. Her smile tightened for less than a second before returning perfectly into place. Eleanor, she said warmly as nearby guests turned toward them. You should be resting. This evening has already been handled. Eleanor looked calmly across the ballroom. That appears to be the problem. Silence spread outward in small waves. David stepped forward uncertainly. Mother, maybe we should discuss this privately. We already tried privacy, Eleanor answered softly. That is how people began signing my name without permission. Several conversations stopped completely now. Thomas approached, carrying additional documents beneath one arm, while Sophia stood beside him with visible restraint. Isabel lowered her champagne glass carefully onto a passing tray. I think everyone here understands there have been misunderstandings during a stressful transition period, she said smoothly. Harrison appeared near the rear doorway beside the old grandfather clock, hands buried inside the pockets of his worn work jacket while he watched the room with quiet amusement. Eleanor accepted the leather portfolio from James and opened it slowly beneath the chandelier light. My husband prepared protections for this family long before he died, she said. Protections against outsiders, against financial manipulation, against fear. Thomas removed his glasses carefully. Under the emergency succession clause established by Richard Whitmore, temporary control of all estate restructuring and trust oversight immediately transfers to Eleanor Whitmore effective tonight. The room went completely silent. David stared at Thomas in disbelief. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. Isabel did not move at all. Only her eyes changed. Eleanor closed the portfolio gently before looking directly at Isabel for the first time all evening. You spent years believing I was no longer paying attention, she said quietly. That was your mistake. Nobody in the ballroom seemed certain where to look after Thomas finished speaking. The piano music had stopped entirely now. Crystal glasses rested untouched in nervous hands while conversations dissolved into silence beneath the massive chandelier. For years, the Whitmore estate had operated like a machine built around money, influence, and carefully maintained appearances. Tonight, the machine had stalled in front of everyone important enough to witness it. Isabel remained perfectly still near the center of the room, though the confidence that usually surrounded her no longer felt effortless. It felt calculated now. Fragile. David stepped away from her slowly, as if distance itself might help him think clearly again. You knew? He asked quietly. Isabel turned toward him with controlled disbelief. David, everything I did was for this family. By transferring assets into offshore accounts. Sophia asked calmly from beside Thomas. Isabel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Victoria crossed the ballroom in sharp, deliberate steps. Enough, she said coldly. This family does not destroy itself publicly over paperwork. Eleanor looked toward Victoria for a long moment before answering. No, it destroys itself slowly when people stop respecting each other. The words settled heavily across the room. Nobody interrupted her this time. Ethan stood beside his grandmother near the fireplace, while James quietly removed the redesigned Whitmore crest display from the ballroom entrance without being asked. Harrison watched the scene unfold from near the grandfather clock, one rough hand resting against the polished wood as though he had already seen versions of this night long before anyone else recognized it coming. Thomas handed several folders directly to Sophia. All restructuring activity is suspended immediately pending formal review, he announced clearly enough for the trustees nearby to hear. One by one, investors and board members began distancing themselves from Isabel without making it obvious. The shift happened quietly. A conversation ended too early. A handshake never happened. A chair remained empty beside her. Old money families rarely screamed during collapse. They simply stopped opening doors. David finally looked toward his mother fully, really looked at her. The exhaustion in his face seemed older now. Why did you never tell me about the trust? Eleanor folded her hands calmly before answering. Your father hoped you would become a man before becoming powerful. David lowered his eyes immediately. Across the ballroom, Isabel picked up her clutch from the marble table near the staircase. This is not finished, she said quietly. Eleanor nodded once. No, but it is finally honest. Isabel walked toward the foyer alone while guests silently stepped aside to let her pass. The sound of her heels faded slowly across the marble floors until the front doors finally closed behind her. Much later that night, the estate became quiet again. Not the cold silence from before. Something calmer, softer. Eleanor sat alone at the far end of the long oak dining table beneath the chandelier, while James poured fresh coffee into Richard's favorite mug beside her. Ethan sat nearby reading through trust documents with Sophia, while Thomas spoke quietly with the foundation trustees near the library doors. Harrison remained by the fireplace watching the flames move behind the glass. For the first time in years, nobody spoke over Eleanor when she finally began to talk.